Hello, today we're going to talk about static fields. We're going to talk about getter methods and setter methods. Now before we start, let's look at the two classes I have, the student class and the classroom class. Student class, we're going to create instances of the student class to hold individual student data. Classroom, we're going to have our main method and we're going to create some students inside it. Okay, so let's look at this first field. Now the great thing about fields is they are valid throughout all the methods in the class. So unlike a local variable that we might create inside a method and would be destroyed when the method ends, these fields are valid throughout all the methods in the entire class. Now let's look at these commands. This says private. What this means is we can't directly access this variable outside of the student class. So if we want to access it from the classroom, we have to have a getter and or a setter method. Static means it belongs to the class itself. So we call the static fields, we also call them class variables because they belong to the class. This is going to be a string and I'm naming it mascot. Now you notice I haven't initialized it, and of course we always have to initialize a local variable before we use it. But fields, if we don't initialize them, they'll be initialized automatically. For example, since this is a string, which is an object fields always default to null. On the other hand, this is an int fields always default to 0. Now, we are more than welcome to initialize a field if we want. This one I've initialized to 123.4. This is perfectly legal. Now, this is something that students do sometimes that's not legal. We've declared it, which is fine, but then we try to initialize it on the next line. And we can't use a command like this outside of a method. If we wanted to initialize class code 2, we would have had to do it on the same line like we did class code 1. Okay, so we want to access these inside the student class in any method, no problem. But let's say we wanted to access them from another class. Since these are private, we have to use what's called getter and setter methods. Now, you notice I made this one public, and that's because we want this method to be accessed from outside of the student class. If we made this private, it wouldn't be very useful as a getter method because it would only be accessible inside the student class. Now, I made this a static method, and that means that we can use it to be accessed from either the class itself or from an instance of the class. And we'll talk about this a little more later. Also, since this is a static method, we can only access static fields. If we had non-static fields, we couldn't access it with a static method. All right, it has to return something, because if it's going to get something, it's got to be able to return it. In this case, we want to return a string. We're calling the method getMascot, and this is again an example of a getter method. You also may hear them called accessor method. It means the same thing. And all this is going to do is it's going to return the data inside the mascot string. It's actually going to return the pointer to the memory location. Okay, this is a setter method. This is if we want to change it. Again, we got to make it public so it can be used from other classes. We're making it static. Static methods, of course, can only access static fields. If it were a non-static method, it could access either static or non-static fields. Void. In this case, we don't want to return anything. More often than not, setter methods don't return anything because they just do something. So we're going to call it setMascot. We have to have a parameter because we got to pass the value we want to change it to. By the way, setter methods are also called Mutator methods. Now what we're doing here is we're saying we want to change the field mascot to whatever is in new mascot. Sometimes students get this mixed up, so they end up changing the parameter to what was inside the field. So we're changing mascot and we're putting the value that is inside new mascot into mascot. And again, this is going to be a pointer to a memory location that's going to be a string on the heap. Okay, so let's look about how we can use this. So we have another class called classroom. Now here I just gave an example of a call to getMascot. This is not legal because it's assuming that getMascot is inside classroom because we haven't said otherwise. Since there's no method inside classroom called getMascot, it's going to say we can't find the method. So how can we do it? Well, what we can do is, since these are static fields, we can either call it from the name of the class, which is student, or we can call it from an instance of the class. So I'm going to start by doing it from the name of the class. So I'm saying call getMascot from the student class. Now, as we discussed, this is going to be null because this is automatically, by default, set to null. Then I'm using the setter method. So I'm saying in the student class, call the setMascot method, and I'm passing this argument here, Duke, which will go to this parameter here, new mascot, and it'll be used to change the field. And then I'm printing out the value again, which will now be Duke. Now here I'm creating a new instance of the class student. So this is an object. I'm calling it Jennifer, and I'm making another one. I'm calling it James. Really, truly, since these are variables, they should be in lower camel case. So let's just change that there. Okay, so I've made these new instances of the class, or we could call them objects. Same thing. I'm saying Jennifer.setMascot to new Duke. Now, since mascot is a static field, this will change it in every instance and even the class itself. So now every mascot is going to be new Duke. So now when I'm using getMascot from James, or even if I wanted to do getMascot from the class itself, it would be new Duke. So for certain things, static fields are great. If when we change one, we want it to change everywhere, a static field is great. Something like student ID, this is not a good choice for a static field because we want James and Jennifer and everybody else to have their own student ID. So that is discussion of static fields, getter methods, and setter methods. Later on, we will learn about non-static fields, and we will learn how to access them using non-static methods.